Hello. I'm going to sit. It's too hot to stand. It's not a TED talk, and I'm not Mick Jagger, so I think it's more relaxing to sit, if you don't mind. So I'm not a designer. I trained to be an architect, but I realized that I was much too impatient and much too incompetent to actually build buildings, which is what you really need to be an architect. So I spent my life as a writer, as a journalist, as an editor, as a curator, thinking and looking at what design really means and what it means to those who are not designers themselves. Because I've always believed that design has something to offer to a really wide audience. Because in many ways, design is a way, I think, to understand the world around us. If you explore an object or an interface or a building or a garment or even a font or a typeface carefully enough, it tells you, I think, a lot about the people that made it, what it means to them, what they will do with it. So unlike our first two speakers this morning, who are both practitioners and designers, I can't talk about my work, but I'm hoping to talk a little bit about where design is taking us and what is its future. Now, deep down, if you're a designer, you need to be an optimist. You need to believe that your work or your activity or your job can somehow make the world a better place, even in the smallest ways. And that's a long tradition with design. There's been a utopian version of design, which is, from William Morris in the 19th century in Britain, a sense that the job of the designer is to make things better. And yet, we also have to accept that the designer's job sometimes is not about answering a question or a problem, creating a commercial product, developing something to sell. But sometimes that job could be about asking questions about what it is that the technology design is working with, is doing to us. So behind me is Buckminster Fuller, the great maverick American genius, half an engineer, half a poet, half an architect, who once remarked in a very provocative way that if you want to predict the future, the best way to do it is to design it yourself. So here he is with two of his creations, the Dymaxion car, which probably was not the car of the future. When he launched it at the Chicago World's Fair in 1937, it crashed and fatally injured a pedestrian. So it didn't go that far, but it was a very extraordinary look at what the future of motoring might be, and it so inspired Norman Foster, who's always idolized Fuller, that he actually recreated it. And here is another project of Fuller's, which I think could be understood in both negative and positive ways. So this was the idea of a bubble covering Midtown Manhattan on a massive scale. And you could see this as Fuller saying that a gigantic technological leap could make Manhattan a more comfortable place. Or you could see it as a dystopian prediction about a planet which was becoming less and less visible, and in which its residents needed to be protected against the environmental damage that people were doing. This is a man who certainly did design the future, and it's extraordinary to think that it's only 11 years since the presentation that Jobs made in Cupertino for the smartphone that has utterly changed everything happened. 1.5 billion smartphones with Apple branding have been sold since then. And when Jobs made the presentation, he teased the audience. He said that he had a 3-in-1 product. So it was going to be a really smart iPod with a music system. It was going to be a phone, hence this remarkable image of the rotary dial. And it was also going to be a neat internet communications device. This did so many things to the way that we live, to the way that we consume, to our relationship with the world. First of all, you could see it as being something like the meteorite strike that wiped out the dinosaurs. Although in the case of the smartphone, the digital revolution wiped out so many kinds of physical object, not just fountain pens, which seem as old-fashioned as crinoline dresses, but the camera, the music system, the bookstore, the department store, so many aspects of that physical world that humans seem to depend on were gone, or have gone, in such a short time. And yet, humans still are programmed to think about things, to relate to objects, to get that sense of touch. This is Dieter Rams's famous calculator for Braun, the German electrics company, which was about as advanced as the digital revolution was in the 1970s. But the team at Apple realized that there was something else going on, that they were needing to give people that sense of the analog world in the digital one. So the first generation iPhone actually had Jonathan Ive's tribute to this as the calculator interface on the first generation iPhone. And in this world in which we still hunger for things, what are the kind of compromises that the digital world can make? Well, it's pretty interesting that Apple chose to make their wrist-held computer in the form of a watch. It's much more than a watch, and yet somehow the fact that Apple put enough faith in this format to remind us of the watch, I think extends the life of the wristwatch in a way that, of course, the fountain pen and so many other categories can't do. What I got there. So this was Ive's tribute to Dieter Rams, and a reminder of how that analog world is still there in the digital one. And of course, there were other attempts to create the sense of value and preciousness around a technological piece of equipment, notably the idea that you could actually brand a phone with high luxury branding and embellish in rather unconvincing ways the object itself. So we have this immaterial world dominated by pixels and lack of physicality, and yet, as I say, we are also a species that wants things. So what are the things that survive in this world? And I suspect that what's happening is that the world is hollowing out, and at one end are the immaterial things, or the generic cheap things, and at the other are attempts to turn design into a kind of art. This is Mark Newson's famous Lockheed Lounger, made famous in a Madonna video, made even more famous for a generation of furniture designers when it was sold at auction for more than $1 million back in the year 2002. And you could also say that art is fulfilling some of these purposes as well. It's not an accident that art is becoming a more and more sought-after commodity in the ranks of the super wealthy. And if you think about work like Jeff Koons's here, it has many of the values of physical design in that Koons's studio operates like an architect's or an industrial designer's, and he has teams of people who draw the shop drawings for this, and then they're sent to a factory in the former East Germany and fabricated with all the care of a Ferrari. But thinking also about the social things, I think even Steve Jobs would not have predicted that that smartphone would transform the way that we meet each other, the way that we fall in love, the people that we choose to have sex with and how we meet them, or that it would actually transform utterly the way that we consume. So without these devices, well, with these devices, the old idea about consuming, whether it's the department store from the 19th century or the shopping mall, is really being rapidly replaced by a consumer using a small object in their hand. And it's changed the way that we travel. And the Uber phenomenon has had both pluses and minuses. In many cities, it's broken into the market by ignoring local laws. It's offended local taxi drivers, but it's changed the way that we move around the planet. And so has the Airbnb phenomenon. And let's not forget, both Airbnb and Uber are less than 10 years old, the blink of an eye. And of course, as with so many technologies, what is presented as a hugely positive thing quite quickly gets to be seen in rather different terms. So from Barcelona to Paris, the Airbnb phenomenon has started to attract some very negative responses. What initially seems like a very benign way for individuals to use their apartment to raise a bit more cash are now turning whole areas of popular cities into no-go zones where the tourists push the locals off the pavement. In Barcelona, there's the famous case of one of the fruit and vegetable markets off the Ramblas, where the stall holders now find that their customers can't get to them because there are such crowds of people taking photographs of their customers not managing to buy fruit. And you're seeing also the impact that the revenues that can be raised by renting out a home to tourists means that it becomes harder and harder for residents to live in these places. And we're seeing technology utterly transforming our ideas about privacy. The digital lock, of course, is a great way for the Airbnb generation to operate. You can actually send people the codes to get into their home without actually even seeing them. But it's also triggering off this astonishing development that Amazon is now encouraging us to allow complete strangers into our homes when we're not there to leave a delivery and then disappear. The idea that your home is your castle is being totally displaced by digitization. So many of these social medias and digital technologies begin with the sense that they are super positive. Let's not forget that Google used to tell us that they do no evil. And here we see the Arab Spring, Tahrir Square in Cairo, where social media was seen as a hugely positive way of an oppressed people bringing down authoritarian governments. But we now know how different the uses that social media can be put to. What brought down an Arab dictator also helped to bring Donald Trump to power in the USA, and you can see some forms of social media as pushing us back to a kind of pre-modern era. Modernity is about reason and logic. Twitter is a digital lynch mob, which is the modern equivalent of medieval crowds with burning torches burning down the houses of people they don't approve of. And you can see that tourism, once seen as a place, as a means of seeing the world and breaking down barriers, is also something which is creating pressures on so many of the world's cities. Or the way that we've been transformed into zombies by our smartphones, in which allegedly Beijing is now considering introducing pedestrian lanes for people who are so plugged to their phones that they've abdicated all responsibility for navigating the streets around them. And we're seeing also the way in which cultural monuments are being transformed in their meanings. This is the Louvre, which is now planning for an astonishing 10 million visitors a year. Ideas about the future once always used to be uniformly positive. The idea of the 50s and 60s, when we thought that the future was an atomic-powered kitchen or a self-driving car, always seemed so charming. And it was only, I guess, when we got to see some of the failures of social housing, of utopian dreams of designers and planners, that we began to think that the future might not necessarily always be a universally positive phenomenon. But when the self-driving car finally materialized, it took, well, this is Waymo's, the Google form of it, carefully designed to look as unthreatening and as cute as possible so as not to terrify pedestrians. But this has, as we know, enormous repercussions. Self-driving vehicles will very quickly put tens of thousands of lorry drivers out of a job on the American highways. They will change our relationship with cars. Even the most dedicated car maniac is going to find it very difficult to build an emotional relationship with something that drives itself. It's going to mean that we probably won't own cars. We'll summon them to take us from A to B, and then we won't need to park them outside our houses. There won't be the need for car parking. When we are in these things, they could be used for conducting a meeting, or getting to know someone, or going on a date. So it's changing the way that cars and their relationship to humans works. When we first saw the MakerBots, we thought this was the doors to a nirvana in which we could print anything we needed, from the scale of the spoon to the house. But it also allowed one Texan-based American law student to get a lot of attention to himself by putting online the components needed to print a handgun. The only bit that's not printed, of course, is the bullet, which you can see. It didn't take off in the States, partly, I suspect, because it's too easy to buy guns anywhere. Or you can see the way that even low-tech developments, the idea of delivering food to your door with a smartphone app, is going to kill the kitchen. So this is what the advertising looks like, and these are the jobs that it creates. And in London, at least, what Deliveroo does is create temporary kitchens in car parks around the edges of the circular motorway that rings London. And people deliver this to your door, which is kind of making the kitchen redundant. So the kitchen in the residential context becomes something much more like an ornament. Some designers spend all their time asking questions and perhaps taking the darker side of what the future might offer. This is a project done by two they were London-based when they did this. They've now moved to New York, Tony Dunn and Fiona Raby, and their work is always characterized as critical design. So it's actually exploring the logical outcomes of ideas that are in the air. And this project was something they called United Micro-Kingdoms of the UK. And it explored a fictional future of Britain long after it's decided to leave the European Union, divided into tribes which are shaped by their approaches to technology and the digital world. And this is going to be, I think, a bit of trouble for the translator, but this is from the communo-nuclearists, which posits the idea of a nuclear-powered train on which people live, touring the country at very slow speeds. And this is the anarcho-evolutionists who believe in using DNA manipulations to adapt their own bodies to the tasks that will face them in this self-sufficient future. And these are the bio-libertarians, who are basically farmers, but will actually end up growing their own machines. A less extreme version is this project by one of their former students, Yosuke Ushigone, which was just nominated by the Swarovski Foundation as one of the designers of the future. And he's exploring the implications of what is probably the most challenging, epoch-changing piece of technology since the smartphone. You can see it on the middle shelf, and of course it is the Alexa Siri phenomenon of machines that listen to us and we communicate to through words, through the spoken word, rather than with a keyboard. And if you think about it, the keyboard has been around for 200 years, and even in the digital era, it has still been the pathway into the world around us. Siri will actually change all that. Think about its implications for the way that people communicate to each other, how they behave to one another. There's already been Amazon's anxieties about the impact that Alexa has had on a generation of kids who have lost the art of being polite. Things happen when they simply say, I want, rather than, please can I have. But much further than that, it will change the way that people write, it will change the way that people learn, it will change the way that they command objects. And that's a big thing, which very quickly becomes normal. So Yusuke's idea was to really try and make visible what this process is doing to us, to try to explain to a generation which have no understanding of what this black box that makes voice recognition work, the scale of what it does. So his idea is a domestic shrine which has at its center point a crystal with a camera behind it, which, when you approach it, recognizes you and invites you to ask for things. And his coding has allowed the device's ability to pick up local data weather forecasting, and his program turns those simple, crude terms of "it will be wet on Thursday" into a form of poetry, trying to celebrate what this is. And we're now looking at the center of the world. This is that area of Silicon Valley where within about 100 kilometers you find 4 of the world's most powerful corporations. This is Google's plans for the future. This is Facebook and the extraordinarily rapid transition it's made. A company which is less than 11 years old has grown so fast that its previous building, this one here, once belonged to an earlier generation of Silicon Valley startup called Sun Microsystems. It too was started by postgraduate computer engineers who for a while built a company which reached about 40,000 employees worldwide. It built a building which housed them. It won awards for environmental friendliness. But when they sold the building to Facebook, they treated it like an industrial ruin only 8 years old, and trashed it to create the environment for the typical Silicon Valley employee who will be aged around 28 and a half and is treated at work as if they were college students, infantilized in this environment where work is signaled by sofas, by kitchen tables surrounded by chairs that don't match, by pool tables, and endless possibilities for change. But there are other ideas about what the city can be and how it copes with time and change. And this is an image of a building in London, in Brick Lane, from the 18th century, which to me reflects a more layered and nuanced idea about what cities can be. This was originally built in the late 18th century by French Huguenot Protestant refugees who were skilled textile workers fleeing persecution in France, where they were being massacred. They came to London, a city of tolerance, and they brought their skills here. And so they built this as a Protestant chapel. And as happens with migrants, they do their part for the community. They build initially close together, and then as they prosper and are accepted, they move on and they move out. So this Protestant Huguenot chapel then became a Jewish synagogue with the waves of migration from Eastern Europe, from Russia, and of course Poland. And then, when they in turn were assimilated, the chapel, the synagogue, has now become a Muslim mosque for another generation of migrants, this time from Bangladesh. And those layers of what we can do with the city and with buildings, to me, seems a better version of what the future might be than Silicon Valley's. But we are at a time when things go extraordinarily quickly. This is the first time in human history that a cultural phenomenon, such as a new edition of Grand Theft Auto, can sell 20 million copies in a single weekend. Just imagine how in human history it's taken for success on that scale. We're now in a world of the instant. And let's all think also about the relationship of designers with their employers. There was a time when design was a small, independent, studio-based profession. This, of course, is the team. This is the location for the team that of the world's most successful software engineers, digital object designers, interface designers is based. It's a town, more or less, in itself of 10,000 people, and it's not actually where this was designed, but this is, from the golden age of Apple. This was the first product that Apple launched after Steve Jobs returned from exile. It was the first project that Jonathan Ive, his chief designer, had, and it was a project to turn a piece of office equipment into something through the use of color that, as Jobs put it, looked cute enough to lick. And this is where the design studio of a previous very successful communications technology company was based. And in this case, it was Olivetti, which allowed its designers to work independently and within the studio for the company. They were allowed to have outside jobs, and this is what they produced 25 years before the iMac. This was Ettore Sottsass' great project, where he also realized that you can turn a very dull piece of office equipment into something which has a personality, into which you understand that physical design has, that emotional characteristics are just as much a functional attribute of an object as the speed with which you can type. But of course, Olivetti has vanished, and Apple is now the most successful company on the planet. And we can quickly see how augmented reality is changing our way with the physical world. The future of design is that, but I think it's also, in so many ways, the future of design is an interface between high technology and low technology. This is the project from Norman Foster, which is trying to set up a network of drone ports in parts of Africa. This is actually an idea for Rwanda, where road communication is so poor that it's very hard to deliver things like medicines that need to be kept at cool temperatures. So the idea is that the drone port becomes a hub made with low-tech materials locally, but is a place in which it can interface with the outside world. Or another optimistic future is this project, Better Shelter, funded by IKEA, which is prefabricated housing, which is attempting to make the plight of the refugee slightly more dignified by offering the basics: somewhere to charge your phone with a USB, somewhere to shelter, somewhere to actually be able to live a slightly more dignified life than is often the case for refugees. Or we can see quite simple development technology. This is IKEA's latest generation. They've realized that humans don't have much time. They don't have the skills to deal with self-assembly as it once was. So everything has been redesigned to be a simple push fit. People think that fashion, some designers, some architects have this idea that fashion is somehow frivolous. I've never believed that. The textile industry is what triggered the Industrial Revolution. Without elaborate textile mills and weaving machines, there would be no digital revolution, because the first digital applications were weaving. But clothing itself is an extraordinary signifier of how we see ourselves and how we show the world who we are. So this image from 1924 shows the Emperor of Japan in the silk top hat and the Crown Prince in the tweed knickerbockers or +4s. And this was a moment not more than 50 years after Japan finally let the outside world in, and it realized, as they said, that to stay the same on the inside, the country would have to change on the outside. So for that moment in Japanese history, to look modern was to look as Western as possible. But less than 50 years later, Japan presented itself no longer as an importer of ideas from elsewhere, from being a copier of Western fashions, to, with this collection launched in Paris in the 1980s by Rei Kawakubo of Comme des Garçons, Japan became a transmitter of ideas as well, a place no longer on the periphery of creative thinking, but at its center. And one can see a very similar phenomenon taking place in China as we speak. So we'll be designing the future in terms of what we wear as well. So those people that made all that money out of the digital explosion, what are they doing with it? Well, in some cases, such as Elon Musk here, they are planning to get to Mars and to live there. And they're also planning to live to be 1,000. This guy is called Aubrey de Grey, who runs a center in California called the Center for Negligible Senescence, which is using DNA manipulations, using new therapies, using new hormones to basically hack the human body to allow us to live to be 1,000. To be honest, to judge by Aubrey de Grey here, he's not going to make it. And what does this actually mean to us? You could say this Silicon Valley oligarch stuff is dividing the world ever more sharply into the top 0.1% who might actually get to Mars, who might actually live those kind of lives, and the rest of us. So if we're going to live to be 1,000, what does that mean to employment in Silicon Valley, given that once you're 31, you're seen as being burnt out in most of those companies? What's it going to do with people who are actually already having longer lifespans, but are living in houses that are not adapted to their needs? Already you can see that there are attitudes changing. It's fascinating that Celine should choose the 80-year-old Joan Didion as the face of their brand, which does suggest that the way that we present the world, the way we present ourselves, is a very different view of what the future once was. So now I'll talk a little bit about the Design Museum, and really to look at what is the point of putting design in museums. We're not a collection of chairs and typewriters. We see the museum as a place which has a strong future because the museum is about a shared social experience. It's a place which is welcoming, which feels special, which is a chance to switch your social media off and go and do something with other people, to see things, to talk, to debate, and really also to look at design both from the perspective of the optimistic and the questioning, to actually provide a platform for Buckminster Fuller's view of technocratic utopia and Fiona Dunn and Tony Raby's critical design thinking to actually really explore not just what is the latest whizzy new technology, but what does it actually mean for us? What does it mean in a world in which, when Instagram was acquired by Facebook, it had, and it was sold for billions of dollars, it had something like 20 employees. Instagram cheekily used the Kodak font for their logo, reminding us that Kodak, now bankrupt, Kodak, a company which in its heyday was doing for photography exactly what Steve Jobs did for computing. Eastman Kodak turned what was a scientific experiment into mass market, everybody being able to take a picture. And there was a time when Kodak had 80,000 employees. Instagram had 12. What are we all going to do in this future if we're not careful? So the museum offers an insight into design from the point of view not just of the designer, but the user and the maker. Our founder, Terence Conran, used to say that unless a designer knows how to make their design, they haven't actually finished designing it. Although Vico Magistretti, the great Italian furniture designer, used to tell his students that unless you could actually explain your design so simply that you could actually describe it over a telephone, you hadn't finished designing it. But we like to show not just Philippe Starck's irritating lemon squeezer, which of course is designed not so much to squeeze lemon, but to become a gift, a ritual gift. But actually the object which makes it is a far more impressive thing than the finished product. And we look at design also through the perspective of temporary exhibitions. So we opened the museum 18 months ago with a show called Love and Fear, which was trying to explore some of these technological phenomena around the world which design has an impact on, which are changing the way that we live and work. So we are anxious about the way in which Amazon and Google know more about us than anybody else does. We are anxious about the impact of climate change. We're anxious about the way that technology is killing off the planet. So we asked 12 people to explore different aspects of that. So this is from the Dutch group, which did a piece about Japanese whaling. This was also a Dutch piece looking at why we don't recycle mass market fashion. Usually it's because we don't actually understand what the component textiles are in the different garments we buy. We had OMA, Rem Koolhaas's practice, exploring Britain's decision to leave the European Union. They created this room for Europe, which was furnished with items, one item each, from all of the member states of the European Union. At the back is an image of Rotterdam in 1945, where OMA are based, in ruins, reminding us why the European Union was set up in the first place. The Venetian blinds in front of it are made up of the colors of all the European flags, except the Union flag from Britain, which is lying on the floor. I'm afraid I can't remember quite what Poland's contribution was to the interiors, but of course Sweden's was an IKEA piece of furniture. And the British contribution was on the wall, a wallpaper from the family firm of the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne. Sorry. And we looked at California, not from the idea of the Charles and Ray Eames period of mid-century modern, but an exploration of what it was that created the spirit that's made it the place now, which has all those extremely valuable companies, companies established in many cases by people who took the hippie trail to India, took too much LSD, and then went home and started companies which one day, which began by echoing the themes of freedom that they'd grown up with, but turned out being something very different indeed, and symbolized here by the Harley-Davidson chopper that Dennis Hopper rode in Easy Rider, which was one idea of freedom, and Google's Waymo, which is another kind of hands-free freedom. And we also looked at the Soviet Union a bit, and every year we explore extraordinary new work from around the world in every category, which we give our visitors an instant insight into what's happening to the world in every category. And we have individual designers showing their work. This is Hella Jongerius, who explored the idea of pre-industrial color. Her point here, I mean, she didn't want to do a retrospective of her own work, but she wanted to say how much we've lost by trying to standardize color. And here these are colors which are not categorizable by Pantone numbers, but allow us to have emotional nuance. And I'll conclude by saying that, of course, we're not only about the physical world and the social experience world. We also do have 4.5 million Twitter followers. So that is the way to keep in touch with us and keep an eye on the way in which design is shaping the future of the world. Thank you very much.